If you know anything about American automotive history, you already know the name Carroll Shelby. He built the Cobra. He helped turn the Ford GT40 into a Ferrari-beating monster. He created Shelby Mustangs that became legends. And for decades, collectors, historians, and racing fans believed they knew the important cars connected to his life. But there was one problem. They didn't know everything. Because behind all the famous cars, trophies, photographs, and racing stories was another side of Shelby's life that remained much more private. His personal garage. And when that private collection was examined more closely, something unexpected emerged. A car that didn't fit neatly into the familiar Shelby story. A machine that wasn't sitting in a showroom. It wasn't being advertised to the public. And it wasn't one of the famous cars every Shelby collector already knew. It had been sitting quietly in the background, waiting. And the strangest part is that Carroll Shelby was exactly the kind of man who could have created something like this. To understand why, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Long before the Cobra. Long before Ford. Long before Ferrari learned to fear an American team. There was simply a young boy from Texas who was obsessed with speed. Before Carroll Shelby became a legend. Carroll Shelby was born in 1923 in Leesburg, Texas. His father was a rural mail carrier, and his family eventually moved to Dallas. But even as a child, Shelby was fascinated by machines. While other children were simply watching cars pass by, Shelby wanted to understand them. He watched races. He studied the drivers. He listened to the engines. And most importantly, he wanted to know what made one machine faster than another. That curiosity would follow him for the rest of his life. By his teenage years, Shelby was already driving. But his first serious experience with powerful machines didn't come from a racetrack. It came from the sky. After graduating from high school, Shelby studied aeronautical engineering before joining the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. He became a pilot. He worked as a flight instructor. He flew powerful aircraft. And eventually he became a test pilot. That experience may seem unrelated to the cars he would later build. It wasn't. Flying taught Shelby something that would become one of the central ideas of his career. A machine was only as good as the person who understood how to push it. After the war, Shelby tried several different businesses. He ran a dump truck operation. He worked around oil fields. He even attempted to operate a poultry farm. The poultry business failed, and Shelby suddenly found himself standing at a crossroads. But sometimes failure doesn't end a story. Sometimes it reveals the story that was waiting underneath. For Shelby, that moment came in 1952. He entered an amateur race at Grand Prairie Naval Air Station. He wasn't driving a $1 million factory race car. He was driving a friend's MG. But something clicked. Shelby had finally found the place where his natural instincts made sense. The racetrack. Soon he was winning. Then he was winning more. And eventually, people outside Texas began paying attention. The driver who refused to slow down. Shelby's career accelerated quickly. He drove Cadillacs. He drove Ferraris. He drove Aston Martins. He raced across America and Europe. And he developed a reputation for pushing himself and his machines harder than most drivers were willing to go. But speed always comes with a price. Shelby suffered serious crashes. He endured injuries. He returned to racing anyway. At one point, a crash during the Carrera Panamericana left him badly injured. Most people would have considered that a reason to stop. Shelby considered it another reason to come back. By the middle of the 1950s, he had become one of America's best-known racing drivers. Then came 1959, and that year changed everything. Shelby was paired with Roy Salvadori in an Aston Martin DBR1 for the 24 Hours of Le Mans. 24 hours. One car. Two drivers. Thousands of miles. Relentless mechanical stress. And almost no room for mistakes. When the race finally ended, Shelby and Salvadori had won. It was the greatest racing victory of Shelby's driving career. But strangely enough, his most important contribution to the automotive world was still ahead of him. Because Shelby was about to stop being only a driver. He was going to become a builder. The Cobra changes everything. By 1960, Shelby's body was beginning to betray him. He had developed a serious heart condition. Eventually, it forced him away from professional racing. For a man who had spent years living at full speed, retirement could have been devastating. But Shelby found another way to stay close to the racetrack. If he couldn't spend his life driving the machines, he could build them. And his idea was almost ridiculously simple. Take a lightweight European sports car chassis, put an American V8 inside it, then make the whole thing as fast as possible. That idea became the Cobra. The combination was unlike anything else. A lightweight body, a massive American engine, and Carroll Shelby's racing knowledge. The result was brutally fast. But Shelby wasn't satisfied. The Cobra was excellent. Yet he knew that speed alone wasn't enough. At high speeds, aerodynamics mattered. So Shelby and his team developed a more aerodynamic machine. The Daytona Coupe. The enclosed body dramatically changed the car's high-speed performance. And suddenly Shelby wasn't simply competing with Ferrari. He was beating them. That victory was important because it proved something Shelby had believed for years. America could build machines capable of defeating the best Europe had to offer. But then Ford came calling. And Ford had a much bigger problem. Ferrari. The war with Ferrari. In the early 1960s, Ford had attempted to acquire Ferrari. The negotiations went deep. Then the deal collapsed. Henry Ford II was furious. And instead of simply walking away, Ford decided to fight Ferrari where it mattered most. On the racetrack, Ford poured enormous resources into its GT40 program. The goal was simple: beat Ferrari at Le Mans. But the first attempts were disappointing. The GT40 had speed. What it didn't have was the reliability needed to survive 24 hours. And that was where Shelby's experience became priceless. Shelby understood something that engineers sometimes learned the hard way. A race car doesn't win because it is fast for 5 minutes. It wins because it is still running when everyone else has stopped. So Shelby and his team went to work. They improved the car. They focused on reliability. They worked on the transmission. They pushed the machine harder. And Shelby had another weapon: Ken Miles. Miles understood racing machines in a way very few people did. He could drive a car to its limit and tell Shelby exactly what was happening underneath him. Together, they became one of the most important combinations in American racing history. Then came 1966. Ford returned to Le Mans with a much stronger GT40 program. This time, the cars survived. Ferrari didn't. And when the 24 hours were finally over, Ford had taken all 3 podium positions. The Ferrari era had been broken, and Carroll Shelby had played a major role in making it happen. For the world, the story seemed complete. Shelby had the Cobra. He had the Daytona. He had the GT40. He had the trophies. He had become an automotive icon. But Shelby wasn't finished. Not even close. The man who could never stay away from cars. After his major Ford years, Shelby eventually stepped away from the automobile business. For a while, he lived a quieter life. But Shelby had a problem. He could never stay away from cars for very long. By the 1980s, he was working with Dodge. Once again, his name became attached to performance cars. Then came another major chapter. Shelby's health problems had continued for years. In 1990, he underwent a heart transplant. Later, he would receive a kidney transplant as well. At an age when most people would have slowed down permanently, Shelby kept working. He returned to the automotive world. He worked with Ford again. He helped inspire new performance projects. And eventually, the Shelby name returned to the Mustang in a major way. The cars kept coming. The concepts kept coming. The ideas kept coming. It seemed as though Shelby's imagination simply refused to stop. But there is something interesting about a man like this. When someone spends an entire lifetime building machines, not everything they create becomes famous. Some ideas become production cars. Some become race cars. Some become prototypes. And some disappear. That's where the garage mystery becomes so fascinating. The private collection. Carroll Shelby's public legacy was enormous. But his private collection told a different story. These weren't simply cars sitting behind glass. They were pieces of his life, different chapters, different experiments, different memories. Some represented racing, others represented business. Some represented Ford, others represented Dodge, and others were simply machines that Shelby wanted to keep. That matters because Shelby wasn't just a businessman putting his name on cars. He was a man who genuinely loved machines. He understood them. He experimented with them. He changed them. He pushed them. And he sometimes kept unusual projects away from the spotlight. That means a mystery car appearing in his private world isn't difficult to imagine. The real question is, how could something so interesting remain unknown for so long? Think about it. This was Carroll Shelby, the man whose Cobra became one of the most recognizable sports cars in history, the man whose Daytona Coupe defeated Ferrari, the man who helped Ford finally conquer Le Mans, the man whose name became a brand recognized around the world. Historians had spent decades documenting his work. Collectors had hunted down his cars. Photographers had photographed his famous machines. Auction houses had cataloged his collection. And yet there was still something that didn't seem to fit. A car hiding in the shadows. A machine that didn't have the same public history as the Cobra or GT40. A car that raised more questions than answers. And that is what makes the discovery so compelling. What they found. When the garage was finally examined, the expectation was probably simple. Find old cars, document them, record their history, move on. Instead, the deeper people looked, the more interesting the collection became. There were rare Shelby-related machines. There were prototypes. There were cars connected to different periods of Shelby's career. And then there was the machine that caught everyone's attention. It wasn't famous because millions of people had seen it. It was fascinating because almost nobody had. That distinction matters. A famous Shelby car tells you what the world already knows about Shelby. An obscure machine tells you what Shelby may have been thinking when nobody was watching. And that is where the mystery becomes bigger than the car itself. What was Shelby planning? Was it an experiment? Was it a prototype? Was it a private project? Was it a test of an idea that never reached production? Or was it simply a machine Shelby loved enough to keep for himself? Those questions are exactly why hidden cars are so fascinating to collectors. Because sometimes the most important clue isn't a badge. It's the fact that someone decided to hide the machine in the first place. And Carroll Shelby understood secrecy. He knew that revealing a new idea too early could give competitors an advantage. He knew that prototypes could disappear when projects were canceled. And he knew that some ideas were better kept private. So when something unusual emerged from his personal garage, the mystery wasn't simply, what is this car? It was, why did Carroll Shelby keep it? The Shelby legacy was never about one car. It is easy to look at Shelby's life and reduce it to a list of famous names. Cobra, Daytona, GT40, GT350, GT500. But that misses the bigger story. Shelby's real gift was his ability to look at a machine and imagine what it could become. He did that as a driver. He did it as a builder. He did it as a racing team owner. And he did it even when his health should have forced him to slow down. That is why the mystery car matters. Whether it was a prototype, an experimental machine, or simply an obscure part of his personal collection, it represents something deeper. The part of Shelby's career that didn't happen in front of cameras. The experiments, the unfinished ideas, the machines that didn't become household names, the projects that existed because Shelby wanted to see whether they could work. And perhaps that is why the discovery feels so appropriate. Because Carroll Shelby's entire career was built around asking one question. Can this be made better? He asked it about race cars. He asked it about engines. He asked it about aerodynamics. He asked it about performance. And apparently, even after the world thought it knew everything about him, there were still secrets sitting inside his own garage. The final mystery. Carroll Shelby died in 2012 at the age of 89. By then, his name had become inseparable from American performance. But death didn't end the Shelby story. If anything, it created a new chapter. Because once the owner of a private collection is gone, people start looking at the objects he left behind differently. Every car becomes evidence. Every prototype becomes a clue. Every photograph becomes important. Every forgotten machine can suddenly become part of history. And that's exactly why this discovery has captured so much attention. For decades, the public knew the cars Shelby wanted them to know. The Cobra, the Daytona, the GT40, the Shelby Mustangs, the famous race winners. But inside his private world, there were other stories. And one of those stories was sitting under a cover, waiting for someone to look closely enough. That is the strange thing about automotive history. Sometimes the greatest discovery isn't a car that sold for millions. Sometimes it isn't a famous race winner. Sometimes it's the machine nobody was supposed to remember. And when that machine is connected to Carroll Shelby, one of the most influential automotive figures America ever produced, the mystery becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because Shelby spent his entire life proving that the impossible could be built. And perhaps, hidden inside his personal garage, was one final reminder of that philosophy. A machine that didn't need millions of fans. It didn't need a famous race victory. It didn't even need a showroom. It only needed one thing: to be discovered. And now that people have started looking at Shelby's private automotive history more closely, one question remains. What else did Carroll Shelby leave behind that the world still hasn't found? Maybe the garage mystery isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the beginning. So, if you could choose just one Carroll Shelby machine to own, the Cobra, the Daytona, the GT40, or the mysterious car hidden away from the public, which one would you choose? Tell us in the comments. And if you think Carroll Shelby's story still has secrets left to uncover, subscribe, because the next discovery might be even stranger.